they changed the locks on a Tuesday. My daughter didn't tell me until I got home from my walk and stood at the front door with my old key, pressing it into the slot over and over like I was the one who'd lost my mind. She opened the door from the inside, smiling like she'd done me a favor. "We had it rekeyed, Mom. The old one was sticking. Here's yours." She handed me a shiny brass key I didn't ask for, to a door I'd owned for 31 years, and turned back toward the kitchen before I could say a single word. I want you to understand something before I go any further. People always ask why someone like me, a woman who raised 2 kids alone after my husband passed, who paid off this house on a librarian's salary, who managed every broken pipe and late tax payment and hard winter without asking anyone for help, would ever let things get so far. I've asked myself that, too. The honest answer is this: she was my daughter, and when you love someone that completely, you keep finding reasons to believe they mean well. You keep reframing things until your own discomfort starts to look like selfishness. I'm not proud of it, but I think a lot of you understand exactly what I mean. My daughter and my son-in-law had moved in 6 months earlier, in February, after his consulting firm folded and they couldn't keep up with the mortgage on their place in Raleigh. They had my grandson with them, 16 years old and barely speaking to anyone. I said yes, without hesitating. Of course I said yes. She was my daughter. They needed a soft place to land, and I had one. I had a 4-bedroom colonial on Birchwood Lane that my late husband and I had bought the year my daughter was born. It had good bones, good light, and enough room. Or so I thought. The first month was fine. They were grateful. My son-in-law fixed the screen door I'd been ignoring since autumn. My daughter cooked dinner twice a week and left the kitchen spotless. My grandson said good morning without being prompted, which I later learned was not something he did at home. I felt useful. I felt like a mother again, in the fullest sense of the word. The second month, things shifted. Not dramatically, just quietly, the way water finds its way through a crack you didn't know was there. My daughter rearranged the pantry. She said it made more sense the new way, and maybe it did for her, but I'd been reaching for the same shelf for 3 decades, and now every time I wanted the olive oil, I came up empty-handed and had to go looking. She moved the couch 6 inches to the left so the television could be seen from the kitchen. She replaced the kitchen mat I'd had since my daughter's college graduation with one she ordered online, gray with a geometric pattern that matched nothing in the room. She didn't ask. She didn't mention it. I came downstairs one morning, and the old one was simply gone. I didn't say anything. I told myself it was just a mat. By month 3, my son-in-law had converted the sunroom into what he called his home office. That room faced east. In 20 years of living in this house, I had taken my morning coffee in that sunroom almost every single day. The light came in golden and slow, and I used to sit in the wicker chair by the window and read until the rest of the world caught up with me. The wicker chair was now in the garage. The room smelled like his coffee and his conference calls and a faint trace of the cologne I'd never much liked. I started taking my coffee in the kitchen. Standing up, facing the wall, my grandson, to his credit, was the only one who seemed to notice. He'd pass through sometimes in the mornings, still half asleep, and he'd pause and look at me standing there alone and say something like, "Why don't you sit at the table, Grandma?" And I'd say something like, "Oh, I'm fine, honey," which was technically true, and also not true at all. The mailbox was month 4. That's the one I still have trouble explaining without my jaw tightening. I came home from my Thursday afternoon book club to find a small white label affixed to the mailbox at the end of the driveway. It said the family name, my last name, but it said theirs first. Their first names listed, then my son-in-law's name, then at the bottom, almost like a footnote, my name, Ruth. Just Ruth, no last name, as if I were a guest in a bed and breakfast rather than the woman whose name was on the deed, the tax records, and every utility bill that house had ever generated. I peeled it off that night. I didn't say a word about it. What I want you to understand is that there's a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from being slowly, quietly erased. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't arrive with a confrontation you can point to and say, "That was the moment." It seeps in. One morning, you realize you've stopped sitting in your favorite chair because your son-in-law sprawls there after dinner, and it's easier not to ask him to move. You realize you've stopped cooking on Sundays because your daughter reorganized the spice cabinet and you can't find anything anymore, and it just seems like too much trouble. You realize you've started apologizing for things that don't require apology. Apologizing for running the dishwasher? Apologizing for having the television on in the afternoon? Apologizing for existing loudly enough that they have to arrange their lives around you? I knew I was disappearing. I just kept thinking love was enough reason to be patient a little longer. Month 5 brought the rules. Not spoken ones, not a conversation at the kitchen table the way adults might handle things, but a printed sheet of paper slipped under a refrigerator magnet my granddaughter had sent me from her trip to Nashville the previous summer. A little guitar. I noticed it first because the paper was covering the guitar. I noticed it second because it was typed in a font I didn't recognize, which meant someone had typed it on purpose, formatted it, printed it, walked to my refrigerator, and put it there without telling me. Household schedule and guidelines, it said at the top. Quiet hours begin at 9:30 p.m. for the sake of early morning schedules. Laundry is to be coordinated to avoid conflicts. Please check with Sandra before using the machines. Meal planning is handled weekly. If you have dietary preferences, please write them on the whiteboard by Thursday. Common areas should remain tidy and free of personal items between the hours of 8 a.m. and 6 p.m. Thank you for your cooperation in making this a comfortable home for everyone. I read it twice, then I read it a third time. It was the phrase, "making this a comfortable home for everyone," that sat in my chest like a stone. As if comfort were something to be built here, rather than something that had existed here for 30 years before they arrived. As if everyone naturally included me in its count. I was not at all sure that it did. I folded the paper in half, put it in the kitchen drawer where I kept rubber bands and expired coupons and a small flashlight with no batteries. Then I went upstairs and sat on the edge of my bed for a long time, looking at the cedar chest at the foot of it. My husband had called it the important chest. That was his name for it. Important chest. Said in a voice that was simultaneously serious and a little bit winking, because he understood that most people stored their important things in banks or safety deposit boxes, but he trusted objects more than institutions. Inside was everything you'd need to prove this house was mine. The deed, the mortgage discharge from 2009, the property tax history going back to 1993, letters from the title company, his handwritten list of every major repair we'd ever made, dated and initialed, because he said someday someone might need to know the whole story of a house, not just the beginning. I didn't open the chest that night, but I rested my hand on the lid for a moment the way you rest your hand on a sleeping person's shoulder, just to know it was still there. The morning it broke open was a Saturday in early August. My granddaughter, my older son's daughter, who was finishing her nursing degree 2 states over and who called me every Sunday without fail, had driven 4 hours to visit. She was the kind of person who brought things. Not expensive things, not showy things, just the right things. She brought me a jar of the orange marmalade I'd mentioned once in passing 8 months earlier. She brought my grandson a book about architecture because she'd somehow remembered he mentioned wanting to study it someday. She sat at my kitchen table and talked to me like I was a full person with full thoughts and full opinions on things that mattered. My daughter was polite to her. My son-in-law was mostly absent. But the visit was good, genuinely good, and after my granddaughter left in the late afternoon, I sat in the kitchen feeling something I hadn't felt in a long time, which was simply like myself. It lasted about 20 minutes, My daughter came in and sat down across from me. She had a particular way of folding her hands on a table when she was about to say something she'd rehearsed. I'd seen it at her college admissions interviews. I'd seen it when she told me she was getting divorced from her first husband. I recognized it immediately. "Mom," she said, "we've been talking, and we think it might be worth having a real conversation about your long-term situation." I looked at her hands. "My situation," I said. "Just you have to admit this house is a lot to manage. 3 adults and a teenager." She paused. "There's a place called Magnolia Gardens, over on Route 9. It's not a nursing home. It's independent living. Your own apartment, meal service, activities. We took a tour last week. They had already taken a tour. We think it could be a really lovely fresh start for you," she continued. "You'd have your own space, privacy, and we'd be so much closer than if we were still in Raleigh." My son-in-law appeared in the doorway then, which told me this had been coordinated. He leaned against the frame with his arms crossed and said, "The unit they have available has a patio. You could have plants." He said it the way someone says a thing when they've been told to say something kind. I let the silence go on long enough that my daughter shifted in her chair. "How much is it?" I asked. "Well, there are different tiers. How much for the one with the patio?" She named a number. It was more than my monthly pension and half my Social Security combined. "And you'd help cover the difference?" I asked. Another exchange of glances. "We'd help you navigate the financial assistance options," she said carefully. "There are programs." So the answer was no. The answer was, leave your paid-off home, take on monthly costs you cannot cover, and do it soon because there's a unit available, and they'd like the space. I nodded slowly. "I'll think about it," I said. What I was actually thinking about was the cedar chest upstairs. I want to tell you something about the quiet that follows a moment like that. It's not peaceful. It's the kind of quiet that has texture, almost like pressure against your ears. I went upstairs. I opened the chest. I took out the worn folder my husband had labeled House Permanent in his blocky handwriting, and I sat in the light from the window, and I read every document in it from first page to last. My name, every time. Ruth Eleanor Callahan, sole owner of record. Mortgage satisfied. Taxes current through the previous December. I thought about my husband sitting across from me at the closing table all those years ago, squeezing my hand under the table while the title agent droned through the disclosures and whispering, "This is yours. Ruthie, always yours." He used to say it when he meant something more than the obvious thing. He meant, "Don't let anyone take the obvious thing." I wasn't going to let anyone take the obvious thing. The next morning, I called my son's college roommate, who had become a property attorney in Hartford and who owed me, in the loosest possible sense, a favor. I had let him sleep on my couch for 3 weeks when he was studying for the bar. His name was Gregory. He was direct, thorough, and not the kind of person who padded a conversation with things he didn't mean. Those were exactly the qualities I needed. He listened to me for 12 minutes without interrupting. When I finished, he said, "You haven't signed anything?" "Nothing. They're paying rent? They buy groceries." "Occasionally. Utilities in your name?" "All of them." "Okay," he said. "Here's where you stand." And he told me, clearly, without drama. Month-to-month occupancy, no lease, which meant I had full legal standing to issue a formal notice of termination. In my state, 60 days was standard. He'd draft the documents, have them couriered, and they would be legally binding. He also advised me to photograph the condition of every room before service of notice, and to change the locks again once the notice was delivered, just to have the timeline clear. "This is going to be hard," he said. Not as a warning, more as an acknowledgement. "It's already been hard," I told him. "Now I'd like it to be over." He laughed, short and genuine, and said, "I'll have something ready in 3 days." I thanked him and set the phone down on the kitchen counter. My daughter was in the next room. I could hear the television, some home renovation program she watched every Saturday, the sound of someone swinging a sledgehammer through a perfectly good wall. I stood at the counter for a moment, listening to the sound of things being demolished, and felt a strange calm wash over me. I made tea. I sat in the one kitchen chair that was still mine without negotiation, the one nearest the window where I could see the yard. The hydrangeas needed water. I made a note to do that in the morning. That evening, my granddaughter texted me. Just 3 words. "You seemed different today." I stared at the message for a long time. Then I typed back, "I remembered something. I'll explain soon." She sent back a single emoji, a small flame, which made me smile more than she probably knew. The notice arrived on a Wednesday, delivered by courier, at 10 in the morning. I was in the sunroom. I had started going in there again in the early mornings, setting the wicker chair I'd retrieved from the garage back by the window, and sitting in the light I'd always been meant to sit in. I heard my daughter sign for it at the door, heard her footsteps slow as she looked at the envelope, heard her call my son-in-law's name in a voice that had lost its usual certainty. I stayed where I was. I sipped my coffee. I watched the light move across the garden. When they came to find me, they were both there, my daughter holding the open envelope, my son-in-law a step behind with his arms crossed but his eyes uncertain in a way I hadn't seen before. "Mom," my daughter said. "A formal notice," I said, "of termination of occupancy. You have 60 days. She blinked. "You're serious." "I've been serious about this house for 31 years, I said. "I'm consistent." My son-in-law unfolded his arms. "Sandra," he said, just her name, which was interesting, because it suggested he'd already had a version of this conversation in his head and had arrived somewhere I hadn't expected him to be. He looked at me with an expression I can only describe as chastened. Not angry, not calculating. Actually chastened. "Ruth," he said, "I want you to know I understand why you did this." My daughter turned to look at him like he'd spoken in a foreign language. "We got comfortable," he said, "and comfortable became something it shouldn't have. It became my house," I said, "run by people who don't own it." He nodded. My daughter looked at the floor. "You tried to tell us," she said finally. Her voice was quieter now, smaller, not the voice she uses when she's prepared her position, but the voice underneath it, the one I used to hear when she was 9 years old and knew she'd done something wrong. "I wasn't clear enough," I said. "I'm being clear now." She sat down on the arm of the couch. "Where would we go?" "I expect you'll figure that out," I said. "You figured out Raleigh. You'll figure this out, too." There was a long quiet. Outside, a car passed slowly on Birchwood Lane. My grandson appeared in the doorway, sensing the gravity of the room the way teenagers sometimes do when the adults have stopped pretending everything is fine. He looked at me, then at his parents, then back at me. "Grandma," he said carefully, "are we getting kicked out? You're being asked to leave, yes?" I said, which is different. He thought about this for a moment. Then, to his enormous credit, he said, "That's fair," and went back to his room. I'll carry that with me. 16 years old, and he found the decency to say that's fair. It gave me more hope than I expected in that moment. The next 6 weeks were not easy, but they were honest. And honesty, I have learned at 68 years of age, is almost always preferable to comfort that is built on something false. My daughter moved through the house carefully, like someone who has remembered a thing they'd temporarily forgotten about themselves. She didn't stop being difficult. She is my daughter, and difficulty is part of her architecture, but she stopped being careless about my presence. She started saying good morning again. She moved the spices back. My son-in-law found them an apartment in town, 2 bedrooms, closer to a firm he was consulting with. It wasn't ideal for them, and I didn't pretend it was. I just didn't pretend it was my responsibility to fix it either, which was a new skill I was practicing at 68 and finding quite manageable. My granddaughter came down the weekend before they moved out. She walked through the house with me, slow, like we were taking inventory of something we'd worried about for a long time. We stood in the sunroom, and I showed her where I'd moved the wicker chair back to, exactly the angle I'd always kept it, and she put her arm around my shoulders and leaned her head against the side of mine for a moment without saying anything. "I knew something was wrong when I visited," she said finally. "I just wasn't sure you were ready to hear it." "I wasn't," I said. "I had to get there myself." "Are you angry at her?" I thought about it honestly. "I'm sad for her," I said. Anger is what people feel when they're surprised. I wasn't really surprised. I knew who she was. I just kept hoping the better version of her would show up. My granddaughter squeezed my shoulder. "The better version is probably still in there." "I know," I said. "That's why I gave her 60 days instead of 30. She laughed. It was the kind of laugh that fills a room. They left on a Saturday morning in September. The weather had shifted overnight, and there was that first real edge of autumn in the air, the kind that smells like wet leaves and possibility. My daughter hugged me at the door. A real hug, not the administrative kind she'd been giving me for months. My son-in-law shook my hand and held it for a second longer than necessary and said, "I'm sorry, Ruth." Not an explanation, not a qualification. Just an apology. Plain and meant. I accepted it the same way. My grandson was the last one out. He stopped on the porch and looked at me with an expression so much older than 16 that it made my chest ache. "I'll come visit," he said. "If that's okay. The guest room has a good mattress," I told him. "And I'll bake on Sundays again." He nodded once and went down the porch steps, and I watched the car back out of the driveway and disappear around the corner of Birchwood Lane. Then I closed the front door. My front door, with my key. The quiet that came after was nothing like the quiet of the last 6 months. That quiet had been watchful and held, like a room full of people all pretending not to listen. This quiet was different. It belonged to the house. It belonged to me. It moved through the rooms like something that had been held outside in the cold and was finally, gratefully let back in. I walked through every room slowly, not cleaning, not assessing, just being in them. I stood in the sunroom, in the morning light. I stood at the kitchen counter, where I had made 10,000 meals in 30 years. I stood in the doorway of the bedroom where my husband had died peacefully, holding my hand, 7 years ago, and where I had learned to sleep alone in the years since, and where I had sat 6 weeks ago with a folder of documents and remembered exactly who I was. I restored things quietly over the following days. Not all at once, the way you restore anything worth restoring carefully, one piece at a time. The wicker chair, already back in position. The spice cabinet, reorganized by my hand alone. Olive oil on the second shelf from the bottom, exactly where my hand had reached for it for 30 years. The photograph from my wedding anniversary that my daughter had removed because it didn't fit the aesthetic she was building in my living room. I rehung it in the hallway, slightly crooked, exactly the way my husband had hung it originally, and the way I'd always left it because I liked that he'd been a little careless with it. I found my old blue mixing bowl in a box labeled Things for Donation in the garage. I carried it inside, washed it, set it on the counter. I made my mother's coffee cake, the one I'd been making since I was 19, without consulting a recipe, because my hands remembered it the way they remember everything they've done long enough. The smell of it filled the house like something coming home. My granddaughter called that Sunday. She called every Sunday. And this Sunday, her first question was, "How does it feel?" And I was quiet for a moment because I wanted to answer it honestly. "It feels like mine again," I said. "Good," she said. It always was. That was true. Legally, on paper, in every document filed with the county, it had always been mine. But there is a difference between owning a thing and inhabiting it fully, between having your name on a document and having your presence in every room. For 6 months, I had owned this house the way someone owns a thing they've locked in a drawer and can't quite bring themselves to look at. Now, I was in all of it again. I lit the candle on the kitchen windowsill that night. The one I hadn't lit in months because my daughter said the scent bothered her allergies. Cedar and orange. My husband had given me the first one 30 years ago, and I'd been buying them ever since. The scent filled the kitchen slowly, and I sat at the table in the light of it, with my hands folded, and looked around at everything in its right place and felt the particular satisfaction of a woman who has done a hard thing and come out the other side of it with herself, intact. I think about what I would say to myself at the beginning of those 6 months if I could go back. I wouldn't tell myself to act faster, though I should have. I wouldn't tell myself not to love my daughter the way I loved her, which was the real reason I waited, not weakness, not confusion, but love, which is sometimes the most complicated reason there is. What I would tell myself is this: the kindness you show someone by allowing them to stay does not obligate you to disappear. You can love someone and still require them to see you. You can want the best for your family and still insist that the best includes you. People told me afterward, some of them gently, some of them less so, that I should have acted sooner, that any reasonable person would have. I understand why they say that. From the outside, the math is simple. But from the inside, when it's your daughter and your grandson and a family that is struggling and a love that doesn't know yet how to have limits from the inside, the math is something else entirely. So, if you're reading this and you've been patient in a way that has started to cost you pieces of yourself, I am not here to tell you that your patience was weakness. I'm here to tell you that it had a limit, and that when you find that limit, the documents are in the chest, the attorneys are in the phone book, and the quiet on the other side of it is yours. My daughter called me on a Thursday in October. She told me about the new apartment, about a farmer's market she'd discovered nearby, about my grandson's interest in an architecture elective at his school. She asked if I'd been baking. I told her about the coffee cake. There was a pause, and then she said, "I know I made things hard, Mom." And I said, "You did." And she said, "I'm going to do better." And I said, "I believe you." I meant both things. That's the thing about family. The story doesn't end when the chapter does. It just moves into a different room. My granddaughter came for a full weekend in November, the first one after the clocks changed. We made soup on Saturday afternoon from the last of the garden tomatoes, canned and stored the summer before, and we sat at the kitchen table until it was dark outside and talked about everything and nothing, the way women who trust each other completely can do without effort. Before she left on Sunday, she stood in the doorway and looked around the kitchen, the blue mixing bowl on the counter, the cedar candle on the sill, the photograph hanging slightly crooked in the hall, and she said, "This looks like you again." "Yes," I told her, "it does." Some mornings, I still have my coffee in the sunroom in the wicker chair, and I look out at the yard where the hydrangeas have gone dormant for winter, and I think about what it costs a person to give up their own space, and how quietly that cost adds up. I think about how easy it was to mistake patience for permission. And then I pick up my mug and I feel the warmth of it in my hands, and I look around the room that has always been mine, and I remember the feeling of pressing my hand to that cedar chest in the dark, knowing that everything I needed to reclaim my own life was inside it, waiting quietly. It had waited long enough. So had I. If you are sitting somewhere right now that used to feel like yours and no longer quite does, I want you to know that feeling is not nothing. It is not you being difficult or ungrateful or too old to adapt. It is your home speaking to you in the only language it knows, which is absence. It is telling you what's missing. Listen to it. The deed is in the drawer. The lawyer is a phone call away. And you have not forgotten who you are. You've just been quiet about it for too long. You don't need someone's permission to remember your own name.